Okay. All right. So we're going to get started. We'll start with a little bit of an introduction on this week's Torah portion. It's actually a double Torah portion. There are sometimes more weeks than there are Torah portions in the year, based on if it's a Jewish leap year or if it is, depending on if the holidays fall on Shabbat, then we don't read the Torah portion on that Shabbat. So it depends on how it falls out. So sometimes we have two Torah portions in a week. So this is one of the weeks. It's one of the weeks that usually it falls together. Parshas Vayakel and Parshas Pekudei. And what actually happens in Parshas Vayakel and Parshas Pekudei is a repetition of Parshas Teruma and Parshas Tetzaveh. In Parshas Teruma and Parshas Tetzaveh, we had the commandment to make the Mishkan, to make the tabernacle, and all the things that went inside, and the clothing and everything. In Parshas Vayakel and Pekudei, it actually happens. We'll talk about it maybe another time why we have to repeat everything. We'll talk about it maybe another time. Anyways, one of the things that happens in this week's Torah portion is the commandment not to work on Shabbat, and specifically what does it mean not to work on Shabbat? So one of the things that happened is one of the verse is in chapter 35. Moshe says that in the beginning of the Parsha, beginning of the Parsha, Moshe says, Sheishis Yamim Ta'aseh Malacha, 6 days you shall do work, of Yom HaShvi Yeh Lachem Kodesh, and on the 7th day it shall be holy, Shabbos Shabbosayin, LaHashem Kol Eiseh by Malacha Yumas, anybody who does work shall die, Lo Yisevar Eish B'chol Mashvei Seichem B'Yom HaShabbos, you shall not kindle any fire on Shabbos. So right away, we know you're not allowed to burn a fire. But in fact, that is the only explicit work that is mentioned in the Torah. Now, later, hold on one second. Yes, we started. Let me just write back. Yes, the class is live. Okay, so here we go. Okay, so in the Moshe says that Hashem has chosen Bezalel to actually be the one to make the Mishkan, and he says at the end of the commandment it says Ubechol Meleches Machshavas, and with any kind of engaged or calculated work. Meleches machshavas, okay? That is the words of the Torah, calculated work. So our sages understood the fact that the prohibition of Shabbos comes next to the prohibition of, next to the acts that were done to build the Mishkan. Our sages understand that the acts that were used in the Mishkan are actually the things that are prohibited on a Shabbos. So there are 39 malachas, there are 39 prohibitions on Shabbos, and these are all acts done in the Mishkan. Okay? So the Torah specifically, though, says calculated work. Okay? Calculated labor. So we're going to dive into that. What does calculated labor mean? So when it comes to calculated labor, the Torah tells us, our sages tell us, that somebody who does work on Shabbos, a technical violation of Shabbos, without intention to do so, is pater. He is not liable for his actions, because it says meleches machshavas, a intentional. We're going to retranslate that, calculated to intentional work, right? An intentional thing is what the Torah said. However, somebody who does not have intent to violate the Shabbos, okay, they are not liable. However, when it comes to other things, if a person, when it comes to other things, there's a debate among the rabbis whether or not a mitzvah requires intent. Okay, but in general, if somebody did not have intention to violate a mitzvah, they are not liable. Okay, and we'll continue. But however, when it comes to positive mitzvahs, okay, So in other words, to break, we'll rephrase that. If somebody did a violation of the Torah, but he did not have the proper intention, it's like it never happened. Okay. However, when it comes to a mitzvah, to a positive commandment, when it comes to a positive commandment, our sages tell us that most mitzvahs do not require intent. Okay. In fact, there are some mitzvahs that even if one was forced to do it, the mitzvah would be fulfilled. His obligation would be fulfilled. So let's dive in. Code of Jewish law. As follows. All mitzvahs require intent in order to fulfill the obligation of doing that mitzvah. Okay. Others say that mitzvahs do not require intent, even when done in passing, one has fulfilled the obligation. And we'll go later in the Code of Jewish law. He brings the example of matzah. Somebody who ate matzah without, because Pesach is coming, so we got to get into this, right? Someone who ate matzah without the intention, meaning he did not intend. What does it mean without intention? It means he did not intend. He intended to eat matzah, but he did not intend to fulfill the obligation of eating matzah on Passover. He has fulfilled his obligation. Therefore, even if he did not wish to eat matzah, and bandits forced him to, right? He was force-fed matzah. He has fulfilled his obligation because, even unwillingly, his body benefited from it. So we see here, there's a difference. By a transgression, we say intention matters very much, right? And if you didn't intend to do the transgression, you're good. However, a mitzvah, a positive commandment, we say, even if you didn't intend to do it, right? It's you fulfill your obligation, right? Even if you were forced-fed matzah on Passover, you fulfill your obligation. So which one is it? Does intention matter or does it not matter? Okay. So before we get into what's the difference, let's try to understand what's going on here. What is a mitzvah? What do we accomplish by doing a mitzvah? By doing a mitzvah, we're connecting to Hashem. In fact, the word mitzvah, one of the etymology of the word mitzvah is the word savsa v'chibur, which means connection. Okay, which means by doing a mitzvah, you're connecting that yourself and the thing that you're doing the mitzvah with, the physical object, to God. Versus when someone does a transgression, God forbid, they're disconnecting themselves from God. So if you think about it, since the things that your physicality is generally, especially things that you're going to do a transgression with, they're not holy, right? And the fact they're not holy, they're trapped. They are, the word asur in Hebrew, the word for a prohibition, also means like trapped, right? In the Torah, when Joseph goes to jail, it's called the Beis HaAsurim, right? The house of the bound, right? Of the confined. So in other words, the physical object is confined to the opposite of holiness, right? To evil forces. So if you're saying that physicality, right? You're saying physicality, I'm using physical objects in order to connect myself from God, or God forbid, it could disconnect me from God. So wouldn't it make sense that physical objects, which are under the domain of negative forces, will be more difficult to make it into something that connects me to God than in something that disconnects me from God? But here we're saying the opposite. We're saying that when it comes to a positive commandment, a mitzvah that's going to connect me to God, we're saying, no, you don't need intent. But with something that's going to disconnect me from God, no, for that you need intent. It should be the other way around. Something that's going to connect me to God, I'm using a physical thing that's under the jurisdiction of negative forces, and I need to use that to connect me to God. I should need full intent in order to get that physical object to be holy, right? Versus the other way around, when it comes to something that's going to disconnect me from God, since that thing is already in the realm of the opposite of holiness, it should just be really easy. Don't even need intent, right? You would think that would be the opposite. Nevertheless, we say that we could even do a mitzvah even against your will, right? In fact, here's a story. The story is as follows. In the Talmud, it tells us a story of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is one of the most important leaders in Jewish history. He lived during the destruction of the Second Temple, and is credited with saving Jewish study by asking the Romans not to disrupt the Torah study even during their rampage. That was something that really saved Judaism in a way. At any rate, so Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said that he once saw in a dream that his nephews were going to lose 700 gold coins. So what did he do? Throughout the year, he forced them to give charity. He said to them, "You must give me charity." And at the end, they ended up giving 683 coins to charity. So what happens? So what happened? At the end, the day before Yom Kippur, the Caesar sent agents to seize 17 coins from them for taxes. So Rabbi Yochanan told them, "Don't worry, they will not take anything more from you. They're just going to take those 17 coins." They said, "How do you know?" He said, "Because I saw it in a dream." Right? And he told them his dream. So in other words, we see here that even though, so first of all, it's an amazing story, right? That he saw that they were going to lose 700 coins, so he said, "Let it go to charity," right? But in the end of the day, they fulfilled the mitzvah of giving charity, even though he kind of forced them to do it because he wanted them to not lose the money to the government, because he knew they were going to lose the money. And we see here, in fact, in the Torah tells us that if somebody dropped a coin and he gives up hope, right? So it's no longer his, and a poor person finds it and gets some sustenance from it, right? He's able to use it for his needs. He fulfilled the mitzvah of charity. Not only that, the Torah tells us there's actually specifically a mitzvah that you can do by forgetting, right? What's the mitzvah? There's a few mitzvahs, but the main mitzvah is called shikha. There's a mitzvah called forgetting. Did you know that? There's a mitzvah called forgetting. So what is the mitzvah of forgetting? It's if you forget a certain amount of bundles of wheat when you're during the harvest, or bundles of produce during the harvest, then if you forget it, then you're not allowed to come and take it back, and it has to go to the poor, and the poor are allowed to come in at a certain intervals and take all this forgotten wheat. So that means you're actually not using your mind, because if you actually leave it on purpose, it's not considered the mitzvah of shikha. It's charity, it's tzedakah, right? But it's not the mitzvah of shikha. Shikha means that you forgot it. So there's actually a way that you could. So that's even more than just saying that you're forced to do it against your will. This is saying you don't even have a will, right? You could do a mitzvah by forgetting something. Okay. So let's one more part of this, and we'll talk about punishment. Okay. Hold on one second. So it's when we say that somebody he is pater, right? He is not obligated. He is not somebody did a mitzvah. Somebody did a transgression without the proper intent to do that transgression. It's not that he doesn't have any punishment. We're actually saying that the transgression did not happen. So for example, we know when it comes to punishment, what happens is that there's something happens to a person when he does when he violates the Torah, that there's a blemish that happens to his soul. So therefore there are different punishments and what's the right word? Different suffering that a soul has to go through before it could go into Gan Eden, right? Before it could go to heaven. So therefore, we're not saying that a person is not going to get punishment, right? We're saying, why is he not getting punishment? He's not getting punishment because there's no blemish that happened to his soul. If there was a blemish that happened to his soul, he would need a punishment in order to cleanse his soul. So we're saying there's no punishment. It's not just that he's not getting punished, but the avera never happened. The transgression never happened. Okay. So here's how we're going to explain how it's possible that somebody could do a mitzvah, but he does not need to have the proper intention. So here's a case in Jewish law. It's brought down in the Talmud in the laws of marriage as follows. If a person was discussing with a woman, about getting married, and during that process, he gave her money or something valuable, right? But he didn't say what it was for, right? So in other words, generally when a person gets married, when you're under the chuppah, you take a ring or something of value and you give it to the woman and you say, "Harei ad mikudeshes li," you are hereby betrothed to me, right? So therefore we know what your intention is with the ring. You literally say, "I am betrothing you. This is what I'm doing with this transaction." So, however, if a person doesn't say anything, then they're not betrothed. They're not married. However, if they're discussing the topic and he gives her the money, the Talmud tells us it's enough. Okay? So, and the same thing applies to a divorce, right? Again, a divorce, you have to say what your intention is when you're giving the divorce document. The same thing applies, that if you are discussing the topic and you give it, it's considered binding. So what is the idea? It's because they were discussing the topic, we see what the person's intention is. So how does a Jew start his day every morning? He starts by saying Modani, a prayer which says Modani lefanecha, right? That I am subjugating myself to God, right? That's the first thing, even before you wash your hands, even before you say you say Al Natilas Yadayim, before you go to the bathroom, before you remove the impurity that comes when you sleep. Even if you're not dressed properly, it doesn't matter. You could say Modani. So once a person says Modani in the morning, he's connected himself to God, and it's as if throughout the day when he does a mitzvah, it's as if he is discussing this idea, right? In other words, a Jew connected to God, and it's as if he is involved with God in every moment of his day. That's a very, very, very powerful lesson. Now, and the same thing goes for the opposite. If a person does a transgression, you have to prove that you're transgressing something, because a Jew is connected to God in a way, because in the morning he said Modani, right? A person is connected to God in a way that's higher than that's a deep connection, right? So it's as if you're talking to God the whole day, so to speak. So you have to prove that what you're doing is against that, right? So in order for a person to kind of do that, he has to say with intention, because it wouldn't be obvious otherwise, because he's connected to God at all moments. So the fact that he's doing a transgression shows that he's going back on that. Okay. And we see that we see that also in the Code of Jewish Law, this idea, right, that if a person has intent to not do the mitzvah specifically, everyone would agree in that case that he's saying, I'm not doing the mitzvah of eating matzah, right? And then he squirts that matzah, right, or eats the matzah, then does not fulfill his obligation, God forbid. So that's kind of the situation. When a Jew is always connected to God, he has to sort of say, because he's in the middle, he's always connected to God, he has to specifically say that he's not doing it, that he's doing this as he's intending to violate Shabbos, or intending to do an action that would be a violation of Shabbos. Okay, so here's the question. So we said, why is a person connected to God in that way? Because in the morning he says Modani, right? He says that that he is connected to God in the morning before he does anything. But what about, God forbid, a Jew who didn't say Modani in the morning, right? Because when it talks about if mitzvahs need intent, it doesn't say, well, if you said Modani, it's good. If you didn't, it doesn't say that. It just says, it's simple. What about a Jew who doesn't even say Modani in the morning, right? He didn't proclaim his faith in God in the morning. So the truth is that why does it work? How is it possible that you could say Modani in the morning before that a person washes his hands, before he prepares himself, right? Because a Jew in reality has a connection to God that's deeper than any impurity, right? A Jew has a connection to God that's in his subconscious, that a person really wants to do the correct thing, right? For example, in the temple, when a Kohen has to have the proper intent when it comes to bringing certain sacrifices, we always, if if he had no intent whatsoever, right, just went through the motions, we say, no, the Kohen had intent. Why? Because he has given himself over, right? Even subconsciously, even though a Jew has his soul is on a connection that is higher than anything else. In other words, I guess the best way to say it is the reason why a Jew could say Modani, he could make that proclamation of faith even before he did any mitzvahs, even before he washed his hands, even if he's not dressed properly. A Jew could say Modani. That's the same reason why that's why a Jew is connected to God. It's not because he said Modani. It's because he's connected to God. He could say Modani, if that makes any sense. So this is like the this is the real connection a Jew has to God, right? So in other words, going back to our original topic, right, of this week's Torah portion about something, if you violate the Shabbos without the proper intention, the answer is no, you cannot violate Shabbos without proper intention, because you are so connected to God that you have to have the intention to do that thing, right? Because otherwise you have to show that you're disconnected to God, because at all moments you have a connection to God that's very, very deep. And at the same time, any mitzvah that you do, even if you don't have the proper intention, right? In that moment, you're connected to God. So we're like, yeah, of course he's doing the mitzvah, right? Because he's connected to God at all times. So it's as if the example of the man who gives the woman a betrothal gift, right? Even when they're discussing marriage, right? So at all times, a Jew is like at that moment. At all times, a Jew is connected to God, no matter what. Okay, there we go. I hope you have a good Shabbos and a wonderful week. See you next week.